Welcome to our show and tell session about Ship of Fools in German and English collections. My name is Henrike Lehnemann. I'm professor of medieval German literature and linguistics at the University of Oxford, and it is my delight to be joined today by colleagues from Bamberg, London and Oxford, who will be launching a fleet of foolish ships for us. The idea for this project came when earlier this year Joachim and Michael Rupp presented the Würzburg project Narragonien Digital to my History of the Book students, and we combined it with a live viewing of a number of different editions of The Ship of Fools from the Bodleian Library. We found that this combination of digital and material exploration of different copies worked together very well, and thought this would be an appropriate offering for the quincentenary of Sebastian Brant's death, to reunite the European heritage of his bestseller. Our presentation will last for about 40 minutes, followed by about 20 minutes of discussion. Since this is a webinar, you will be muted and invisible throughout, but you can put your questions throughout our presentation in the Q&A, and we will pick them up in the discussion round. Feel free to say hello in the chat now. First of all, let me introduce my colleagues who are here with me on the panel. I will start with Alissa Steiner, the pilot who got all the ships sailing in order. Alissa studied for a master in Oxford 3 years ago and organized, as a History of the Book project, an exhibition on printing in Basel. She then went to Bamberg University for a doctoral studies on the Narrenschiff and currently is back for a research trip to Oxford. This brings us to the harbour masters of the 6 copies of the Narrenschiff we are going to see. Dr. Alex Franklin from the Bodleian Library is the coordinator of the Center for the Study of the Book at the Bodleian Library and also oversees the printing press on which Alissa and I printed this morning a commemorative card for Sebastian Brant. The cataloguing of the copies that we are seeing from the Bodleian was actually done by Dr. Bettina Wagner during her time working for the incunable catalogue here in Oxford. After a time at the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, she is now director of the Staatsbibliothek Bamberg. Last but not least is Susan Reed, curator in the British Library's German collections since 1993 and a huge force for the good of German studies in the UK, also as editor of the European Studies blog. The order in which we will launch the ships is going to be first the High German editions, then the Low German, finally 2 Latin editions. The 3 curators will introduce each copy as it comes on screen, and then Alissa Steiner will contextualize them, and we will take turns in reading from them, since we are lucky to have with Alissa a Baseldeutsch native speaker. Over to you, Bettina, to launch the first ship.
Yes, hello and very welcome to this afternoon session from Bamberg also. It's a first event for us to take part into an international seminar, and I'm very grateful to my colleagues and friends in Oxford and London that we have been included in this event. The State Library in Bamberg is one of the 10 regional libraries in Bavaria, plus the big central library in Munich, the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek. Those regional libraries were created in the early 19th century to accumulate medieval manuscripts, early printed books, and other rare items from the regions of Bavaria. The kingdom was formed in 1806. We are extremely lucky in Bamberg to have an enormous number of medieval manuscripts, 1,000 manuscripts, of which 165 date back to the period when the bishopric was founded in 1007. But less well known than those precious Ottonian manuscripts are the incunables, which are here in Bamberg, a collection of about 3,500 items of 2,800 different editions. Most of them come from monastic libraries in the region, and we will see some of the provenances today. Among these 3,500 incunables, we have 14 copies of the Narrenschiff, both in Latin and in German versions. And it's a great pleasure today that we have 2 copies in each language which are not in Munich. So this justified our contribution today. So I'm looking forward to demonstrating you the first edition when Alyssa will be talking about it.
Great. So the first book we're going to look at, the first Ship of Fools we're going to look at today is actually a 3rd edition Ship of Fools. The very first Ship of Fools was published in Basel in 1494. The Ship of Fools we're going to look at today was published 1499 by the same printer, Johann Bergmann von Olpe. And I think if we can now have a first look at the ship, that'd be great. Exactly. So the Ship of Fools, contrary to maybe Plato's ship, which a lot of people know, is not a ship, a state ship. It's a ship representing our souls. Exactly here, the title page, 1499, Dr. Brant Narrenschiff, the Ship of Fools by Dr. Brant. And we can already see the beautiful woodcut, a ship with lots of fools falling off of the ship, fighting with each other, and sailing at Narragonium, so to the land of fools, as opposed to the people on St. Peter's nave or the people in the church ship. So the Ship of Fools holds all of our sins, and if we remain on the Ship of Fools, we'll eventually go under, sadly. Exactly. So I'll be reading out a first little passage from the prologue. If we can leaf through to the next page, we can see, yeah, exactly, ein Vorrede in das Narrenschiff, so the prologue to the Ship of Fools. First, a small prose prologue and then a longer prologue in verse, from which I'm going to now read out a tiny little passage so you can get a first impression of how the late medieval Alemannic sounds. All Straßen, Gassen sind voll Narren, die nüchtern mit Torheit umgehen, wollen doch nicht den Namen haben. Des hab ich gedacht, zu dieser Frist, wie ich der Narrenschiff aufrüst. Galeen, Füst, Krag, Narven, Park, Kiel, Weidling, Hornach, Rennschiff stark, Schlittkarren, Stoßrouten, Rollwagen, ein Schiff macht dir mit all getragen, die jetzt sind in der Narrenzahl. So, all of the streets and alleyways are full of fools, and therefore Sebastian Brant has decided to build up a fleet of ships to hold all of the fools. One ship would not be enough because there's just too many fools. So we can already envision the fools walking onto the ships and sailing to the land of fools. What we can see here as well is the very typical layout. So we have the nice borders on every single page of the Ship of Fools, combined with the text. And if we now leaf through again, through the exactly, so here we can see on the borders as well, they include fools climbing up. So the borders are thematically linked to the text. Exactly. We can leaf through to the first chapter. Exactly. So this, the first chapter von unnützen Büchern, chapter about useless books. or unused books, represented by the iconic book fool, here depicted sitting at his desk with a fly swatter, swatting away the flies that sit on his books that remain untouched for the most part. And I'm gonna quickly read out the first few verses as well. So the book 4 says, Den Vortanz hat man mir gelan, dann ich unnutz viel Bücher han, die ich nicht lies und nicht verstan, von Büchern hab ich großen Hort, Verstand, doch drin gar wenig Wort, und halt sie dennoch in den Ehren, dass ich ihn will, der Pflegen wären. So he has lots of books, but doesn't understand any of the things written in them. Nevertheless, he holds them in high esteem and swats away the flies that sit on them. Exactly. Here we can also, this is a very representative chapter. So we first have a motto, then the woodcut, then the title, 4 verses, and then 30 verses on the opposing page. So most chapters are either 34 or 94 verses long. So high level of planning went into laying out the chapters in the Ship of Fools. So this is Bamberg 3rd edition. Now compared this to the same edition currently in London. So once again, the 1499 edition now in London, presented by Susan. Susan, do you want to say a few?
Yes. Yeah, sorry, I was muted. So this is from the British Library's collection, which is one of the largest incunabula collections in the world. Who has the largest depends on how competitive we're feeling and how we're counting. This one, we don't know quite where it came from. We haven't got any information about its provenance. It came to the library, it was purchased in March 1846, and it probably came in this binding. It's clearly not as old a binding as the one on the Bamberg copy, probably 18th or early 19th century, and has a list possibly of booksellers or former owners, references, bibliographical references there, and it usefully informs us it is complex. Yes, and so there's not much evidence of who owned it. There are very few annotations here and there where people have added, or someone has added a note, usually a reference to a Bible verse or a couple of times to Aesop. Presumably these are things referred to in the text. Alyssa will know more about that than I do.
Great, thank you. Yeah, one of the notable things with this 1499 edition is that the title page is changed from the original edition. So the famous Book of Fools, Ship of Fools woodcut, everyone knows, is sadly not in this 1499 edition, but as we'll see at the very end of this little presentation, this is actually the woodcut that we can find in the Latin translation. So this 3rd German edition already reflects the great success the Ship of Fools meets within just a couple of years, integrating the Latin woodcut into the German. As we can see the navis in the woodcut. Exactly. Another thing that reflects the great success in this 3rd edition is the objection that Sebastian Brant includes in this book. So we just had a look at the prologue, but in front of the prologue we find the objection, which is on this page as well as the recto page. And this includes comments by Sebastian Brant on some of the reprints that we made in the years following the first edition in Basel. So once again, I'm gonna read out a couple of verses, and you're very welcome to read along in this book as well. So he writes, vor hab ich's Narrenschiff gedicht, mit großer Arbeit aufgericht, und das mit Dorn also geladen, dass man sie nicht durft anders baden. Ein jeder hat sich selbst gerieben, aber es dabei nicht blieben. Viel mancher hat noch siem gedunken, nachdem vielleicht hat getrunken. Nur Riemen wellen da anhängen, dieselben sollten wohl gedenken, dass sie vorsäßen in dem Schiff. So Brant here writes that many people were inspired to add verses, maybe even after they had had a pint or two. And he reminds them that they themselves actually are on the Ship of Fools as well. So he's not entirely happy with the fact that people freely amend his text in the editorial princaps. Exactly. What we can also see just under the title is the printer's motto, niet on oorzaak, which means as much as nothing without cause. And if we leaf through to the book 4 again, we can exactly, thank you very much. We can see in the third line under the title, ohne Ursache ist das nicht getan. So here referring to the the book 4's place is not without cause, referring back to Johann Bergmann von Olpe's motto. So we can ask ourselves if this book 4 is meant to maybe represent Brant himself, or it could also be a reference to Johann Bergmann von Olpe. I think before we go on, we can also have a brief look at the very end of the book, look at the printer's mark there and the motto. Exactly. So here on the right-hand side, we have the register, and then we have the end of the Ship of Fools. So here ends the Ship of Fools, and then Johann Bergmann von Olpe's printer's mark, which includes his motto, again, niet on oorzaak, with the lily on the top of 6 little hills. Great. I think the time has come to move on to the interpolated new Ship of Fools.
Hello and welcome to Oxford. Greetings from the Bodleian Library. I'm going to present the copies from the Bodleian Library's incunable collection, but I should say that everything that I say today is dependent upon the work of Bettina Wagner and her colleagues who created the 15th century book catalogue. And you can find most of the records online at Bod Inc. So Alyssa has asked me to just show this copy. This is shelf marked Auct 7Q520, and the catalogue record in Bod Inc. is B505. The binding is 18th century. There's very little information either inside the book or recorded in the catalogue about the provenance. It's recorded as having been purchased by the library in 1860 for £2.19.
Great. So this is a text version known as the New Ship of Fools, which was first published in 1495 in Strasburg, so just 1 year after the first edition in Basel. This specific edition is a reprint from 1498 in Augsburg, which changes a few things compared to the Strasbourg editions, but just looking at these first two beautiful woodcuts, we can see that these were actually taken from the Strasbourg edition, even though the title was changed. So we can see the fools in their ship, as well as other fools joining them. Most strikingly, we can see that now the text is in 2 columns as compared to 1 in the Basel editions, this so the Strasbourg interpolation, the New Ship of Fools, is most notable for its text, which adds detail and extends the text by many verses. So just looking at the prologue, which starts right on this page here, the prologue we just looked at in the Basel edition is 136 verses long. The Strasbourg interpolation here in the Augsburg reprint is 259 verses long. Similarly, the chapter on the bookful, can leaf through. Exactly. Goes from 34 verses to 110 verses. So extends the text quite a bit. Mostly it's added detail. So for example, in Brandt's texts are usually kept really short or extended. More details are added to make it easier for readers to understand. What we can see here as well is obviously the woodcut was changed. So already the Strasbourg first print edition of the Strasbourg interpolation changes the woodcut. This Augsburg reprint once again changes it. So compared to the Basel edition, we can see this is first of all a lot smaller and lacks some of the detail included in the Basel edition. Other than that, we can still see that the motto precedes the woodcut, then we get the title, and then the text follows. The borders that make up such an essential part of the original Basel editions, however, is gone. If we leaf back exactly here, we can see an additional woodcut included in the prologue. If you just very quickly go back to that woodcut in the prologue, that'd be great. And here we can see the scene I was reading out earlier. So we can see the fools walking towards the ship, sailing at Naragonium, singing happily, crying out, shouting out to their mates to join them on the Ship of Fools. So a lively scene that we can see here. The objections we just read out earlier very specifically comment on this interpolated version of the text, which, as I said, add a lot of verses to the text. So Brant comments on the fact that here we get a lot more detail, which ends up messing up the rhymes and messing up all of the work he put into his Ship of Fools. Exactly. So together, this interpolated version, as well as the text we can find in the Basel editions, together they make up the basis for the next ship we're going to look at, which is the Middle Low German ship, which is a bit of a highlight of today's session. Which I'm very excited to see myself today. Great.
So this is one slightly interesting thing about this. It's, again, we don't know where we got it from, what its provenance is. We don't even have an acquisition date, though I from the crossed out shelf marks, I would hazard a guess at sometime in or after the 1850s. But on the title page, there is this note to the binder, which has been helpfully transcribed by the compilers of BMC, so we don't have to. Which is in swarte bredt, rodtt, in Snedt gefaruett und mit goldt darup gedruckt, diese buchstabe I.V.D. So in other words, be bound in black boards, coloured red on the edges, and with the letters IVD printed on it in gold. And what is interesting is that somebody in this rather horrible, what my binding colleague politely calls a 19th century retrospective style leather binding, which I think is just a bit pseudo oldie worldy. It's been gilded on the top, and I don't know if you can see some traces of the red, the original red, on the edges.
Great, thank you so much. And one important fact is that this is one of only two remaining copies of the Middle Low German Ship of Fools, which makes this all the more exciting. So it was published 1496 in Lübeck, so in the north of Germany, by the anonymous Poppy printer. And we can already see this looks quite different from the two high German Ship of Fools we just had a look at. In terms of the text, as I said, this Middle Low German Ship of Fools takes both the Basel text version as well as the Strasburg interpolated text version and combines them into a new version of the text, which then in addition also includes some local references. It opens up with this title page where we can see a crown, then the dat Narrenschiff, the title, as well as Hinze van Narrenberg and Kunze van Gexhusen, two fools, which will follow the reader throughout the text. If we then turn over the page, we meet a third fool, Hänselin Eselsohr, and we see a first depiction of the Ship of Fools. Specifically, so these woodcuts were specifically made for the Lübeck Ship of Fools, although they very much resemble the woodcuts in the Strasburg interpolated version of 1495. Later on in the book, the printer also included woodcuts from Danse Macabre that was printed in Lübeck around the same time. So this is very much a product of Lübeck printing, of North German printing. If we leaf through a bit more, we get to the prologue. And Vorrede, we meet Hinze and Kunze again, and then we get to the book 4 chapter. So we see here this oh, I think you've gone a bit too far.
There.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the book 4 chapter now in the Middle German version, and Henrike is going to read out the first few verses for us to hear how different this sounds from the Alemannic dialect we just had in the High German versions.
So I start from the paragraph mark on the left-hand side. Manch nitte Borg habe ich und doch gut, dat ich nimmer mehr recht lese ut, ook nicht versta des Bokes meen, met ich jage darauf pflegen, rot und de Kleen. Dat it sitte voran in dem Schip, dat heft wehrlich en sunderlich Begriff. An Orsake is it nit, lovet me, wenn ich verlate mi ob min Liberie. Van Borken habe ich Fähle gehört, ich verstar da inne doch wenig Wort, und doch holde sie denne noch in den Ehren, dat ich en will den Flären wegen.
Great, thank you, Henrike. Yeah, so here, if we look at the woodcut, I think a very nice detail is the flies sitting on top of the books. Once again, the book holding the fly swatter in his hands. The book 4 in the Middle German version comes up a couple of times because it's actually, this book is used as a structuring element throughout the book. So if we leaf through, yeah, right here, we can see not only do we once again meet up with Hinze, Kunze and Heinzelin, we also find this book 4 woodcut again. It's comes up a few times to structure the books into 4 not really equal parts, and they're usually accompanied by little texts saying that now a quarter of all of the fools are on the ship, and then half of all of the fools are on the ship, but there's still a bit of space left for more fools, and then more chapters follow. But here we can really see how this Middle German version changes the structure and the layout quite significantly. With these 3 different ship of fools, so the High German Basel edition, the High German interpolated new ship of fools, and this Middle German ship of fools, we have covered the 3 main German ships, which make up one part of the transmission. What we haven't yet looked at is the probably more important part of the transmission, which starts with the Latin edition, which really makes the Ship of Fools the European text it is today. So I would suggest that we now go on to look at our next ship. Go back to Oxford once more.
Hello, and here we are again. And this time in this incunable edition, there's something which has a lot more provenance information. The Bodleian holds some 33 pre-1700 editions of this work, including 13 incunable editions in German, Latin, and French. And in these collections, 10 of the incunable copies and about 12 more editions from before 1700 previously belonged to the antiquary and the former keeper of manuscripts at the British Museum, Francis Dowse, whose vast collections of manuscript printed books and picture prints came to the Bodleian by bequest in 1834. The imagery of folly was one of the favorite themes of Dowse, and overall his bequest formed a notable addition to the Bodleian, not only because of its size, which included nearly 500 incunables and over 400 manuscripts, but because amongst some magnificent book treasures, Dowse also avidly collected works in the vernacular and those of interest to lay readers. So we can see here relatively simple binding, 18th, 19th century with marbled paste downs, and many more signs of use by Dowse and earlier owners, including this portrait of Sebastian Brant pasted inside the first flyleaf, and on several of the pages there are pen additions and even copied out or added verses. I'll just turn just to the very back of the book where we can see some more of Dowse's additions before Alyssa goes on to talk about the text. Here we see Dowse has added yet another portion of a picture print without the longer verse, and yet another here about a kind of book fool. And also there's a note that appears to be in Dowse's handwriting, but I hope colleagues will correct me if that's wrong, that compares the, as it's called, inscriptions, or I think the lettering in different woodcuts in different language editions of the work. And I wasn't able to trace all of these different comparisons, but this seems to be a comparison, a very close study of the woodcuts. I'll turn back to the front and then I will be guided by Alyssa on the next steps as we go through.
Great. Yeah, this is actually a great first page to stay on. Quickly can go back. The author portrait of Sebastian Brant opposing the title page. So we see Sebastian Brandus, Kia Titio, his Latin name, Titio meaning as much as like a burning log or a burning piece of wood, referring back to Brand, meaning a fire. So this is quite notable. Sebastian Brant, even though he was a humanist, was one of the few to mostly go by his German name. There's only a few passages where he himself uses Titio to refer to himself. It was mostly his humanist friends who insisted on referring to him by his Latin name, Titio. Then when we look at the title page, we now see the Latin title Stultifera navis, as well as the woodcut that we encountered in the very first book we looked at, the third High German edition printed in Basel. This was printed 3 years, first published 3 years after the German edition, by the same printer who had printed the German edition, Johann Bergmann von Olpe. Once again, we can see his printer's motto, Nihil sine causa, nothing without cause, 1497. If we then leaf through, the most apparent thing, the most striking thing certainly is the very large number of paratexts we encounter here. So in the German editions, we had the prologue, but here we get over 10 different paratexts, including letters from Brant to Locher, Locher to Brant, a letter to the printer, as well as different texts introducing the motif of the Ship of Fools. The text itself was written by Jacob Locher, who was a student of Sebastian Brant. One of the paratexts actually explains that Sebastian Brant had initially planned to translate the Ship of Fools himself, but then just caught up got caught up in other work and didn't have enough time, so ended up delegating this huge task to his student Jakob Locher. The Ship of Fools really is at the heart of the European non-German transmission of the Ship of Fools. So in the Prologus Jacobi Locher, we get a nice passage where Jacob Locher explains that he hopes to reach the French, Italians, the Spanish, Hungarians, and also the Greek by way of this first Latin edition, which we can see here, which here very wonderfully also includes a little added for the side. I would suggest that we go to folio 6 verso, where Bettina Wagner will read out a first little passage of the Latin text. So this is a passage written by Sebastian Brant himself, rather than his student Jakob Locher.
Yes, the texts we have here are Latin distichs, so metric verse, a hexameter followed by a pentameter. And as a German, I'm going to read them in the German version of medieval Latin, and I'm trying to make the meter scan correctly. Hortor ad este viri, quos nunc vocat eurus eiundum stultorin patriam carbasa plena volant. Tendite narragoniam properat quab litore funem rumpite nec morasit, uncta carina natat. Illicet opruimur numerum sine fine videtis qui comitatur eum non capit una ratis. Nec reputate viam maribustum taxat apertam, quin et femineast copia mixta viris. Per vigil exigit noctes mihi crede perennes, quinus collegit, compositque rati. Et merito, quis enim nostrum praesentia curat, praeteritis vedolet, sive futura cavet. Contemplator agoc speculum, quicumque cupiscis, scier hominum vitas, interitusque gravis. I'm not translated. I think you know the German text by now.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so maybe just as a brief summary, this is Sebastian Brant calling on all of the Ship of Fools once again, calling them to join the group of fools and join them on the ship. Exactly. And once again, he repeats that without sleeping, he spent many nights bringing together all of these fools on in this fleet of ships. In a similar vein to what we've already seen in the different German texts. Exactly. My suggestion is to wrap this up. We're going to go and look at one last Latin Ship of Fools. We just had a look at the first edition. Now let's have a look at the second edition, which looks slightly different. Exactly. We're back in Bamberg.
Yes, and I have still the copy I showed you in the first place on my desk, just to remind you of what a contemporary 15th century binding looks like. This is the only evidence we have for the provenance of our German Narrenschiff here in Bamberg, a binding probably made in Leipzig in the late 15th century. Now, if we move on to the Latin edition, this has quite a different appearance, it's a very plain sheepskin binding, but it's an enormously fat volume. So this alone shows us that the volume, the number of pages of the Narrenschiff increased in the Latin tradition. But what we also have here in this volume is two other items which were added, bound together with the Narrenschiff. The first one is a Latin edition of satires by the famous classical Greek author Lucian of Samosata, a satirist, Venetian edition with quite a beautiful printed border around the title, and even some painted decoration, contemporary decoration, which has now been identified as coming from a Nuremberg workshop. We have a project here in Bamberg to identify painted decoration in our incunables, and very recently this has been analyzed and identified. So we have a Venetian book decorated in Nuremberg. This alone is evidence for travels, book trade in the 15th century. Then as a second item, we have the Narrenschiff, which I'm going to skip for the moment. And as the third item in this composite volume, we have the Varia Carmina by Sebastian Brant, another Basel edition printed in 1498. So the Narrenschiff fits neatly between those two items, and you can see it takes up a lot of space in this very fat volume. Where does this volume come from? We go back to the beginning. We find some old shelf marks, and on the title page of the Lucian, there's an ownership inscription, Langheim, 1673, a Cistercian monastery near Bamberg, and the binding, the very plain sheepskin binding, was probably also made at the same time. So the three items were probably joined in Langheim. Maybe they were joined before that. It's not really possible to tell whether that composition was like that before. Now for the Latin Narrenschiff, which stands in between those two items, I leave Alyssa to explain the contents.
Great. So this was published in the same year as the first Latin edition. It's only a few months later. So the assumption goes that they really wanted to bring out the Ship of Fools as quickly as possible, based on its great success in the German version. So published a first edition early in the year 1497, but hadn't actually completely finished the book. So published a second edition later in the year in August, which includes a bit more detail. So this really is the Latin edition as Brant and Lochop probably wanted it to look like. So if we look through, once again, we can see the many paratexts, and then we move to the book full to see its Latin iteration. So already what's very apparent is the marginalia, which we don't have in the in the German text, but which are included here in the Latin, as well as the page numbers, which we didn't have in the German. So the marginalia just reference texts that with corresponding passages, and really are supposed to help the reader better, or can help the reader to better understand certain passages, but sometimes also cause a lot of confusion. Yes. So here the book full, once again with the same woodcut we already know from the German Basel edition, but with a slightly different layout. So the borders have been dropped, almost replaced by the marginalia, but overall the layout is kept the same. So we got the motto, then the title now standing next to the woodcut, and then the text starts on the bottom. What is new here in the second edition is the text right next to the woodcut. In the first edition, this is kept empty. So that's the main difference between those two editions. Other than that, and page number on top, other than that, much of what we see here strikes as being quite familiar. If we go into the text, I've been talking about how this is a Latin translation. That's a very loose definition of translation. The text is in large parts quite independent from the German text. So it picks up on lots of the same motifs, but adds a lot of new things as well. So it's more of an adaptation, similarly to how the Strasburg interpolation and also the Middle Low German translation are adaptations of the Ship of Fools. And I think to end this, I'm going to ask Bettina one last time to read out a few verses for us before we then go into the discussion.
Yes, we start at the top of the right-hand page with the heading De Inutilibus Libris, about useless books, and then the meter starts again. Inter praecipos pars est mihi redditas dultos prima, rego docili vastaque vela manu, en ego possideo multos, quos raro libellos perlego, tum lectos negligo nec sapio. Primus in excelsa teneo, quod nave rudentes, stultivagosque sequor comites per flumina vasta. Non ratione vacat certa sensuque latenti, congestis etenim stultus confidu libellis. Should I turn the page? Four more lines. Spem quoque nec parvam collecta volumina prebent, caleo nec verbum, nec libri sentio mentem. Attamen magno per me servantur honore, pulveris et cariem plumatis tergo flabellis. The last word, flabellis, is the wonderful implement which he holds in his hand, in his right hand, the duster with which he dusts the books on his shelves without reading them.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Bettina. So yeah, this ends our little run through of some of the many Ship of Fools. I think I can only suggest to all of you to take these Latin Ship of Fools as a starting off point to look at the French Ship of Fools, the Dutch Ship of Fools, or of course the English Ship of Fools, which followed this Latin edition. So yeah, go to your libraries and discover your own Ship of Fools.
Many thanks, Alyssa. This was splendid, a really wonderful naval display across the channel, and it's good to see these connections running to and through between Bamberg, London, Oxford, and we would be very happy to extend them further and take, as Alyssa said in the end, the international dimension further. Before we go to the question and answer session, just a short plug. If you want to see more book fools in further iterations, come on Wednesday to our next digital editions launch, where you'll see the ship of fool, the book fool, a mirror image, so taken from the Strasburg version and now heading a Lutheran pamphlet, the Pfaffenal. I've put the link in the chat, and that also leads me to the first in the question and answers. Nicola Sherman asked about the woodcuts and whether we know of anybody who actually produced them. We have in the audience Michael Rupp, who I know, for example, published on the lobster riding fool and the career of this lobster throughout Europe. And this is one of the woodcuts which are very likely to have been produced by Albrecht Dürer for the edition. So at least for the Basel version, we know of some of the woodcuts. Alyssa, do you want to say more on the Basel side? Or rather not. So perhaps I could then link it with a Lübeck question. So we don't know names of those artists working for the Mohnkopf or Poppy press, but as Alyssa pointed out, they use woodcuts across the whole range of their production. So the Dance of Death has a similar woodcut, so it certainly was a local artist. And yeah, thanks Sheila said hoch soll leben to Sebastian Brant, well, at least in heaven. For his day-to-day. So, but clearly the Lübeck woodcutter as well as the Strasburg artist had access to these early editions and based their woodcuts on these models from Basel, and that's also the reason why they are mirror inverted.
I think for the Lübeck edition, we do know that they, because based on the text, we can assume that they had probably the Basel first edition, the reprint, unauthorized reprint from Nuremberg in a slightly different dialect, as well as the Strasburg interpolation. But for the pictures, they quite certainly based the pictures on the Strasburg interpolated version, because some of the detail included in the Basel woodcuts, which are not included in the Strasburg woodcuts, are also not included in the Lübeck woodcuts.
Yeah. Michael, do you want to say anything more about artists? Tom has unmuted you, so you can speak if you want.
I don't know if I can say something more about it. I don't know much about the artists of the Lübeck edition. And for the Basel editions of Bergmann, I just know there is the name of Dürer for the Hauptmeister. And as far as I know, it is still believed, he's still believed to be the Hauptmeister, because there are some argument against it, but yes,
yeah,
it's still the only name.
Yeah. But Basel certainly had the power, the money, and the attraction for up-and-coming artists who would be fairly well paid, and so it would be an attractive position to work for these printing presses.
Yeah.
The other question was asked about bibliographic information about the editions of the Narrenschiff that we looked at today. So we've given basic information in the blog post with which we announced this event, and we'll link into their further editions. So in general, the Narrenschiff is very well bibliographically accessible, either through this Narragonien Digital, the link I've posted in the chat, where you will find all the numbers for the GW, the Gesamtkatalog der Wiegendrucke, the incunable catalog, and the numbers for the incunable short title catalog. So going to one of these will lead you to further information, and you should have the basic information in the email that was sent out, or in the general element. Are there further questions? Is there a question from Alex or Sue or Bettina about some of the other versions we have seen? Otherwise, I would say we've reached 4 p.m. And it was quite a tour de force, or to keep in the ship metaphors, a race across the channel to get them all in